during the conference and move on to our next panel speaker, who is also an esteemed expert in the field, and that's Dr. Jean-Pascal Zanders, who is the founder of the Trench and an independent researcher and consultant specializing in questions of armament and disarmament, covering biological, chemical, radiological, and nuclear weapons, as well as space policy. And he's bringing quite a lot of experience, being previously project leader at the Chemical and Biological Warfare Project at the Stockholm Institute for Peace, International Peace Research Institute, CIPRI, in Sweden, and also director of the Geneva-based Bioweapons Prevention Project. And his background is in political science and linguistics. So, Dr. Zanders, we very much look forward to your presentation this morning. Thank you so much for agreeing to participate.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. Thank you also to all the organizers for their invitation for me to speak here. So I will be addressing questions of chemical weapons more specifically. And right now I am sharing the presentation. Okay, here it is. So the task given to me was to have a look of the challenges posed by toxic chemicals and the evolving options for misuse. To start off, the question I would like to put to you is, how do you actually understand chemical warfare? So, among the list here you see on the screen, what would you consider to be chemical warfare? So I'll let you have a short moment to go through these various elements. So probably there are a number of bullets that you would immediately identify as chemical warfare without any hesitation. Take the first one on the left, the shelling or bombing of a military position with phosgene or mustard agent clearly refers to chemical warfare. However, it can become a bit tricky. If you think of releasing a toxic substance from a storage tank into a river during an industrial strike, now, is that chemical warfare? We have the toxic substance, it affects the environment, it can kill animals and potentially affect drinking water of humans. If you go a bit lower, releasing a malodorant, another word for a stink bomb, in a theater to protest a play, would that be considered chemical warfare? Well, the chances are that you are getting into trouble with a number of the proposals here. And the challenge is really that we have two key concepts that were used for decades and today are becoming more difficult to define. And the two concepts is, on the one hand, chemical, and on the other hand, warfare. However, in the examples that I've just shown you, we had a variety of issues. Common to all of them was the use of a toxic chemical. However, the context of usage was quite different. Also, types of agents in each one of the examples were different, and at the same time, the volumes of agent were also different. So the context that we looked at were battlefield use, which would be the traditional understanding of chemical warfare, but we also had terrorist actions, individual assassination, industrial or economic sabotage, and law enforcement. So More and more, what we have to do today is actually use the term use of chemical weapons, or even the use of toxic substances versus chemical warfare. And key to understanding the challenges today is understanding the context and the circumstances in which such toxic agents might be used. So, in generally speaking, what is chemical weapon use then? Well, the general idea is the intentional application for hostile purposes of toxic substances against humans, animals, and their environment. And you see three words highlighted in red. One is intentional. We have to differentiate from accidents. Hostile purposes, it means that people, animals, and their environment may be targeted. And toxic substances, obviously, that differentiates the chemical weapon from other things. And the hostile purposes, the targets of those hostile purposes can be humans, animals, and their environment. Now, that's the general understanding of chemical weapon use. I just want to say, in the Chemical Weapons Convention, you will not find environment in the definition. That's for political reasons, had a lot to do with the use of certain agents in Vietnam during the 1960s and early 1970s. The basic agents we have are the blood agents to prevent the exchange of oxygen to tissues, phosgene being an example, choking agents that interfere with the breathing, such as chlorine, nerve agents that attack the central nervous system, like sarin, and the vesicants that produce the blisters, like mustard agents. Most of these are have a high risk of being lethal if a person is exposed to them. Other agents, however, have been selected by military forces to avoid killing people, but rather to put them out of action for a certain time. And here we, in that category, we have two main types of agent. The first one are the central nervous system acting agents, previously more known as incapacitating agents, and they induce a temporary physical disability or mental disorientation. So LSD, which you might know as one of the recreational drugs, particularly popular towards the end of the 1960s, was actually researched as a potential military agent. BZ, or buzz commonly known, was also used, investigated for use. And as already mentioned by Günther in his presentation, fentanyl is also one of those types of agents currently, well, it has been used in the early 2000s during the Moscow siege by Russia, the theater siege in Moscow. And there are many other types of developments about which we're going to hear later today. Contrary to those group of incapacitating agents, we have the irritants, and they induce short-term irritation. By short-term, basically the definition means that as soon as a patient, as a victim, is no longer exposed to the agent, the symptoms should disappear. Not always correct, but that's the general definition. Tear gas, lacrimatory agent, is a typical example of that. And then the final group are the anti-plant agents, such as herbicides and growth inhibitors, and so on. Now, what we have to do is put these types of agents in the threat spectrum posed by chemical weapons. So the most traditional one are the war scenarios, what we have seen during the First World War, what we have seen during the Iran-Iraq war, but also in Syria more recently. Then we have terrorism and political violence. We have to look at assassinations and a variety of criminal acts. What is very important in terms of understanding the threat is that each actor, be it a state, be it a terrorist entity, be it a criminal band, they will consider different types of agents. They will have the ability of access to different types of agents, and those will have different degrees of toxicity. However, it is not necessarily the agent that will determine whether they want to use it. The group, the entity wanting to use such a weapon will have certain intent. It will have a certain goal. And in function of that goal, it's going to select certain types of agent. Another aspect that plays a role is how available is such an agent. Most of the typical military type of agents are quite hard to come by. You can get the ingredients, but then you also need to have access to expertise, to knowledge. You have to have access to specialized types of equipment and obviously also protection. And finally, it also depends on the technical skills and the type of structure of the organization on what they actually can do. To have a type of program as set up by Shinrikyo in Japan in the 1990s, you already need quite a sophisticated organization to be able to set up the program, but also to be able to hide it from public view and in particular from law enforcement. So what we have to do is also to look at the alternative uses of chemical agents. As already mentioned, they can be used against humans, and the possibility of mass casualties cannot be excluded. But the agents that could be responsible for mass casualties could also be the most difficult ones to acquire. So we might look at the possibility of incapacitation, and that means that more agents are available, but also they pose less of a risk to the perpetrator. Agents to be used against animals and plants then would be considered for their economic impact. Again, they would be easier to acquire and less of a risk. And they're quite easy to deploy. If one thinks of the food chain from the place where vegetables, plants are, or animals are being raised in the fields to what is actually in the shop where you buy it, there are many vulnerabilities. During processing, during transportation, and even in the shop itself, it's possible to inject poisonous substances into a tube or a tin, a can. Another target could be economic and societal disruption. And here one wants to interrupt the functioning of utilities, commercial enterprises, or public agencies. And a wide range of agents become available. Just think of tear gas, pepper spray, for example. This is commercially available in many countries. There have been incidents where such a spray can was emptied into the air conditioning system of an airport, and obviously the facilities had to be evacuated. So the purpose is to create fear, not necessarily to kill or physically harm people, but to create fear. That's one of the purposes of terrorism. And if that fear has been created, then also hoaxes can become effective. In other words, you create the illusion that a toxic substance was released. People will have to mobilize units to identify, to investigate the incident. Areas may have to be closed off. That can all be part of the disruption. And then finally, we also have to look at assassinations, which can be state-sponsored, terrorist, or criminal in nature. One particular type of use of toxic agents that has come to the fore more recently is what I call the opportunistic use of toxic agents. And that basically means that whoever wants to use toxic agents will turn to any available toxic chemical. And these toxic chemicals are, you can find them in many places. They are at stores, at industrial plants, water purification facilities, and so on. And many toxic substances are also being used in agriculture, including pesticides, insecticides, herbicides, and other anti-plant agents. One has to know that among the pesticides and anti-pest agents, many belong to the family of the organophosphorus compounds. Now, that's a wide range of toxic chemicals. On the one hand, you can find them in an insect spray can to kill insects. On the other hand, you will find them among the sarin, the VX, and the Novichoks. But many of those toxic substances used in agriculture actually are in a mid-spectrum between those and can cause very great harm, especially if large volumes can be deployed. So characteristic of the opportunistic use of toxic agents is that there is no development of production of the agent by the user. And that means if such attacks are being conducted, well, they will also cease once the resources, the stores have been depleted. And in the case of the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, ISIL, we have seen that there was a development of the delivery system, but not of the agent there. I'll come back to that later. So some of the examples we have seen was in Sri Lanka, the Tamil Tigers, who used chlorine from a paper mill after their ammunition ran out. Before the war in Syria, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, or Aki, the precursor to ISIL, used chlorine in a truck bombing campaign. What they used there was actually they hijacked lorries coming from Jordan and Syria, filled with liquid chlorine for water purification in Baghdad. So they had to drive the whole across Iraq from the west to Baghdad. Then they fit those lorries with explosive devices and detonated them. It's very interesting to know that during that period, from 2006 and mid-2007, that nobody died from exposure to chlorine. The people who got killed in those suicide attacks actually died from flying debris from shrapnel. And the bomb, the explosive device, actually destroyed most of the chlorine. We've seen similar developments in Iraq and Syria with ISIL, and the development of the delivery system. We see that rather than using lorries, ISIL was experimenting with mortar bombs and improvised explosive devices. But when we are looking at those three examples in Sri Lanka, Iraq, and then most recently in Iraq and Syria, this is probably not terrorism we are talking about anymore, but the cases represent use of chemical weapons as a method of warfare. So the concept of a chemical weapon is really changing fast with all these different scenarios that we can consider today. Until the end of the Cold War, we were looking at vast arsenals that counted in tens of thousands of metric tons of agent. So the Soviet Union, Russia as a successor state, declared around 40,000 metric tons of agents. The United States, at the end of the Cold War, had around 30,000 tons, declared 28,000 to the OPCW in 1997. In the Iraq-Iran war, here the arsenals were counted in several thousands of metric tons. If we look at the Syrian civil war, there that was already reduced to hundreds of metric tons, and the chemical weapons program in Syria was about 25 metric tons. So you can see the numbers drop very fast. When we go to terrorist use, we're talking about kilogram amounts, and for assassinations, I mean, all we need are grams or milligrams. So while the range of hostile use of toxic chemicals broadens, we at the same time see that the relevant volumes drop considerably from the levels during the Cold War. And just for a final thought, you know, a big question to ask is why, you know, over the past few years, we have seen a return to chlorine as a warfare agent. I mean, in 1915, the first chemical weapon attack, the first instance of modern chemical warfare in Belgium, chlorine was released at Langemark near Ypres. During the Syrian civil war, again, we saw the use of chlorine as a weapon both in Syria and Iraq. So the question is, where is actually the progress? In 1915, chlorine, its manufacture was high technology, and the weapon, in consequence, was also high technology. And during that first attack in 1915, about 160 tons were released over a 7-kilometer front. And the Germans produced around 600 tons for the chemical weapon campaign. But today, chlorine is a banal industrial commodity, and annual production exceeds 60 million tons worldwide. So there is a certain paradox where we see the return to chlorine as an expression of the success of the Chemical Weapons Convention, because the more potent agents have been banished. But it also presents us with a challenge. In many of the instances that we have been discussing today about chemical weapon use, we have to consider that for many of the actors, it is not the gold medal technology that is relevant. We also have to keep an eye on the bronze medal technology. The things of yesteryear remain just as relevant as they are today. And with that, I end my presentation, and I'm happy to take questions from you.
Thank you so much to Dr. Zanders for his very insightful talk and detailed overview of how the threat of chemical weapons has evolved over the years. I now would like to turn to our audience and see if there are questions or comments or any thoughts. At this point in time, I don't see questions in the our Q&A. Right, so there is now one. Well, so that's a bit of a provocative question, but would you agree or disagree with the statement? Do we need to change the Chemical Weapons Convention in any way, given the evolving threats and changing security challenges?
Yes, that's an excellent question, actually, and it is one that the parties to the Chemical Weapons Convention are actually facing today. The Chemical Weapons Convention was negotiated in the late 1980s and the very early 1990s. In other words, the scenarios that diplomats at the time were looking at were mainly the chemical warfare scenarios of yesteryear. And I have mentioned the larger volumes of agent that were relevant. So the idea is, what is a relevant volume of agent to pose a security threat? As I've made clear in my presentation, that has changed completely, and the number of scenarios. So how does one have to go about this? Well, one option would be to amend the Chemical Weapons Convention, but that would open many cans of worms, because people would want to change perhaps even the definition of a chemical weapon and so on. But there are certain types of challenges, and the emergence of terrorism, we have to realize that, for example, what drew global attention to that risk were the attacks by Shinrikyo in the early 1990s. Now, that happened in the period between the conclusion of the negotiations in 1992 and the entry into force of the convention in 1997. So there was a gap in between those two. So too late to have terrorism included. So what happened was that the states parties, they set up a working group to look at the specific issue of terrorism with chemical weapons. And they've come up after many years of work. It was not easy, with a number of recommendations whereby certain parts of the convention were actually reinterpreted also in function of the terrorist threat. And so a number of provisions, for example, in terms of assistance and so on, have been extended to use of chemical weapons by terrorists. Other areas are developments in science and technology. So there was a certain understanding of a chemical weapon in the 1980s, but as our next speaker, Malcolm Dando, will introduce later on too, we've seen new forms of convergence between chemistry and biology, leading to the exploitation of new types of substances, even cellular particles, that could have toxic impacts on the weapon. And the third element we have to look at is that as we understand other types of weapon better and their impact on human physiology, we may have to reinterpret certain agents as being chemical weapons. And that goes for white phosphorus, for example, because it has long-lasting impact, even transgenerational impact on the humans who were even lightly exposed to burning with white phosphorus. So many things are changing. The other aspect where we have to look at, and that's going to be the bigger challenge, is the whole verification regime. What do states report? What states have to report is included in schedules. These are 3 lists of toxic chemicals and their precursors. And the 3 lists actually reflect a balance between commercial, industrial relevancy of the agents and the threat they pose to the Chemical Weapons Convention. So the Schedule 1 chemical weapons basically have no legitimate purposes. 2 are former chemical warfare agents and their precursors, and 3 are toxic chemicals and precursors of concern, but which have a wide commercial, industrial relevancy. So that balance will always have to be reconsidered. Fortunately, the schedules, they have a simplified method of adaptation, of amendment, but still it is not easy. one of the big changes was already the inclusion of two main families of Novichok agents in those schedules. But in terms of the verification, inspection routines, well, these are based on an understanding of the chemical industry in the 1980s, again, with all the advances in production processes, new ways of producing agents. The fact that, you know, the chemical industry on computers researches new compounds, new molecules, is able to characterize them on the computer without doing anything in a laboratory, for example. All that information is stored in databases, and the potential for highly toxic new chemicals is very high. There is, I mean, a figure was mentioned by the former science advisor at the OPCW of 17,000 new chemical compounds being registered in the Chemical Abstract Service every day. So it gives an idea of the challenge. And more recently, we have also heard of you know, designing agents through artificial intelligence. So there are many challenges that need to be addressed. It's a diplomatic forum, so change is going to come slowly, but there is a lot of pressure, particularly from civil society and academia, and Malcolm Dando is a great example of that. And I also see Michael Crowley sitting there, who also actively works in that area. So the pressure is there. There is also a scientific advisory board, so they are on top of you know, the latest developments in science and technology. But whether it's how well the CWC will be able to develop is quite another question, particularly because its strength is the great detail of the verification regime. But if one has to look at evolution, it might actually become something of a handicap with time.
Thank you so much for the very detailed answer. And I don't see any additional questions in the Q&A, but I would like once again to quickly abuse my privilege of being a moderator and just pose one additional very quick question. As you mentioned, verification, and I think that one development that merits some attention now in the Chemical Weapons Convention is the phenomenon of targeted assassinations using chemical agents, and what kind of a challenge to the integrity of the regime that pose, given that we've seen the exchange between Russia and Western countries, the continuous denial of accountability, and attempts to undermine efforts to investigate and establish accountability for those kind of criminal activities. So how do you see this as a challenge going forward with the regime? Thank you.
Well, the challenge is twofold, and right from the start, I'll come back to that. I want to differentiate between dealing with the agents and accountability, especially in the context of the CWC and the work of the OPCW. The first thing is, as I've explained in one of my slides, for assassination, all you need are like grams or milligrams of agent to do, which means that we would not be looking at a major production facility. This is something that can be synthesized in a laboratory on an ad hoc basis, so to speak. So while it is possible, and forensic science with regard to chemical weapons has really advanced enormously, especially in view of the war in Syria. And now the investigations OPCW teams were able to conduct on the ground. But so also in terms of the Novichok agent, something very new, the basic characteristics could be established. We know as a historical fact that Russia was the country of origin of those agents. Russia is, of course, creating a smokescreen because as people were trying to characterize those agents, in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, well, people came up with different variations of a Novichok agent. And as I've already mentioned, there are families of agent. There are many variations possible. But the key point is that Russia has an interpretation of the definition of a chemical weapon that is closely linked to the 3 schedules. So it rejects the general purpose criterion by which any toxic chemical, whether it's listed or not, falls under the convention. So since the Novichoks were not listed, it never bothered to declare them in the first place. The second aspect is even with a challenge inspection, that is a situation where one country calls for a very special, no refusal, very quick inspection of a particular location to see if anything goes wrong. Now, even that becomes very difficult because you may know which building such activity is being undertaken, but not necessarily which room in the building. And because the challenge inspection is under a process which we call managed access, in other words, people, the subject of the challenge inspection may refuse access to certain areas, and the idea is they have to offer evidence to explain that nothing in violation of the convention is taking place. But if you misidentify the room, your challenge inspection is 0, and there is an enormous loss of face, of course, and the propaganda machine can start churning. So it is very difficult. The tools are there, but they're not practical, particularly if we are looking to the level of production of milligrams and so on. I mean, that can be hidden very quickly, of course. So we do have a number of challenges. Now, you also spoke about accountability. Now, the OPCW, the Chemical Weapons Convention, is not about accountability. What they do is collect information, collect data and evidence of non-compliance, and that includes use. That information is not something that the OPCW, that are the member states, is going to use to judge who is criminally responsible for what. That information, the OPCW, and that's also a recent decision, will make available to the relevant United Nations bodies, including, the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court, where war crimes can be judged. Where the states parties are going to judge the facts given by the investigative teams is a violation of the Chemical Weapons Convention. But that has happened in the case of Syria, and right now Syria is suspended from voting. It has lost its voting rights within the Chemical Weapons Convention until it comes clear with its declarations on past chemical weapon programs and its use. But there is not going to be a judgment about who is responsible, despite the fact that they will identify who may have committed certain acts. And I see Ralph wants to
Thank you so much.
comment.
Yes, you can see that one of our panelists. If Dr. Ralph Trapp, very quickly if possible, we would like to have you.
I'll be very short. Thanks to Jean-Pascal for his explanations. Just one aspect that I wanted to add to it. There is the dimension of assistance. We've seen this in the in the decision of the OPCW on how to deal with threats of chemical weapons, assistance by the OPCW or through the OPCW to member states, including in areas such as investigation and national procedures. And I want to emphasize the importance of this relationship with national procedures. We've seen this also in the area of criminal prosecutions, where international law takes its time to kick in and sometimes cannot kick in for a range of reasons, but countries can still take action. And there it is important that you can share information and you can help people developing investigative technologies. And so the CWC can play that role as well. Thanks.